I never thought the first time I met my fiancé's father would begin like a trial. When the heavy wooden doors opened, dozens of cold eyes immediately swept over me. The soft scrape of chairs on the floor, the clatter of silverware being set down in unison, no one smiled, and there wasn't a single word of greeting. All I could hear was a weary sigh from a corner of the table. Clearly has no sense of decency. And Michael, the man who had held my hand through so many difficult seasons, now sat with his back straight, avoiding my gaze. His face was tense, his eyes filled with a raw shame. I stood lost in that luxurious room, where every detail exuded power, yet I was being treated like an outsider. That feeling of being judged, disdained, and stripped of my place in my own relationship was like a cold knife twisting deep into my self-respect. I knew that with a single wrong word or a misplaced glance, my future with Michael would shatter right in front of everyone. If you have ever been in a situation where you had to prove your worth to a family that didn't want you, you know how deep that pain goes. Please share your experience in the comments, because sometimes your honest words can make someone else feel less alone. I tried to stay calm and took another step, but the heavy atmosphere around me felt like it was suffocating me. At the head of the table, Richard Coleman, the man I was supposed to call father, sat motionless. His expression was grim, his eyes like ice, watching me like a judge waiting to see how the defendant would fumble. And in that moment, I understood this dinner wasn't a family gathering. It was an examination, and with a single small mistake, I would be completely eliminated. You're listening to this story, and if you feel that what I went through has also happened to you, please follow this channel to continue with us through these real slices of family life where sometimes cruelty is revealed most clearly over a lavish meal. I was just an ordinary office worker. My days were spent with files, dry reports, and repetitive meetings. My family was simple. My father taught at a high school, and my mother was a nurse at the town hospital. We had a small house and simple meals, but there was never a shortage of laughter. I grew up in a world where a person's value was measured by their kindness. There, you didn't need a lot of money to be respected, you just needed to keep your promises, know how to say thank you, and care for others. So I never thought I would one day step into a space where every chair, every glance, was heavy with pressure. Everything started when I met Michael. He was different from the image of a rich man's son I had heard about. Not flashy, not loud, not boastful. In our first few meetings, he was simply a man who knew how to listen. We met at a small conference, and I was surprised that he asked me more about myself than he talked about himself. Michael gave me a sense of peace. I saw him as a man I could lean on, but the more I loved him, the more I realized there was a shadow lurking behind him. That shadow was named Richard Coleman, his father, a man who had built a massive empire and then disappeared from the public eye. Outsiders called him the reclusive billionaire. But to Michael, he was a constant, living fear. Once, Michael let it slip. My father doesn't hug me. He sets tests. If you don't pass, you disappear from the dinner table. He said it so calmly it was terrifying, as if it were a normal house rule. I was stunned, but Michael told me more. A cousin had been written out of the family will for marrying a girl who didn't meet Richard's standards. An aunt had been disinherited for daring to argue with him at a family party. These weren't rumors. They were facts, as cold as the numbers in a contract. I understood. Entering this family wasn't about being welcomed. It was about passing an exam. The invitation to dinner only confirmed it. It came from Richard Coleman's law firm, a formal but cold document. The presence of Michael Coleman and his fiancée is required at the private residence for dinner with Mr. Richard Coleman. Not a single "we look forward to it" or "it would be our pleasure," just a command. In the days leading up to the dinner, Michael barely slept. He repeated himself to me like a machine. Don't talk about your job. Here, they look down on small professions. Don't talk about your family. In my father's eyes, poverty is failure. And don't be late. Being late means you're incompetent. Every word he said was like a knife cut to my pride. Why should I have to hide what made me who I am? My job, though not glamorous, was honest work. My parents, though not wealthy, had raised me with a lifetime of sacrifice. Was all of that worthless just because it wasn't defined by money? But when I looked at Michael, I saw not just worry in his eyes, but a plea. He took my hand, his voice trembling. Our future depends on this evening. If my father accepts you, everything will be easier. I loved him, and that love made me stay silent. I didn't agree with these absurd rules, but I didn't want to let go without fighting for us. I prepared. I wore the blue dress Michael had bought for me, stood in front of the mirror, practicing my smile, practicing answers to unnatural questions. But the more I tried, the more I felt like a stranger in my own skin. That night, I was no longer myself. I was just a candidate, walking into an interview where the outcome would determine my marriage and perhaps my entire life. When I came downstairs, Michael looked me up and down. He nodded and let out a sharp breath. His gaze wasn't that of a man in love, but of a student checking his attire before an exam. I smiled, but my heart sank. I knew that our love had been placed on a scale, and on that scale, I would always be the lighter side. The waiter placed a plate in front of me without a glance. The gesture lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to make me feel like I wasn't a guest, but an imposition. The steady clink of silverware on china was a cold, emotionless soundtrack. I looked down and picked up my fork. The heaviness in the air made my hand tremble slightly. Across the table, a woman with her hair in a high bun glanced at me, then turned to whisper in the ear of the man beside her. They let out a soft, barely concealed laugh. I heard two words clearly, not worthy. My heart ached. I wanted to pretend I hadn't heard, but my ears betrayed me, straining to catch every painful sound. Michael leaned in and whispered, so low only I could hear, I told you, don't draw their attention. I turned to him, my eyes meeting his, which were filled with tension and shame. There was no protection in them, only blame. I bit my lip hard. In that moment, I wasn't just being scorned by the Coleman family. I was being treated as a burden by the very man I loved. At the head of the table, Richard Coleman remained silent. He didn't say a word. He just took a sip of wine, his sharp, cold eyes never leaving me. It felt like he was taking invisible notes. Posture, tone, reaction. Every move I made was evidence in a trial. A middle-aged man in a red tie looked up and asked Michael, his voice a mix of a joke and a sneer, Is this the one you chose? The air at the table suddenly grew heavy. Michael froze, and I felt as if I had been slapped. The man didn't even bother to ask for my name. No introduction, no acknowledgement. Just the one you chose. Michael forced a laugh and replied, Yes, she works in an office. His voice was weak, timid, as if he were admitting to something shameful. I sat motionless, my heart feeling as if it were being squeezed. Everything I had been proud of, my hard work, my honesty, my love for Michael, was reduced in this room to a single label, a mediocre office job. Another woman spoke up, her voice airy. And her family? Is there any background? Michael was silent. He looked down at the table, avoiding everyone's eyes. I felt every thread of my self-respect being stretched to its breaking point. He didn't dare to mention my parents. He was afraid that admitting I grew up in a small house, with a teacher for a father and a nurse for a mother, would make me a joke in his family's eyes. I wanted to speak up. I wanted to tell them about our simple but love-filled meals, about my father who taught me patience, my mother who taught me compassion, but my mouth was dry, my tongue felt heavy. I knew that if I opened my mouth, everything I was proud of would be twisted into a flaw. Richard Coleman set his glass on the table. The sound was quiet, but the entire table fell silent. He stared at me, his voice low, curt. Do you have anything to say? The room felt like it was running out of air. I sat up straight, but my chest was empty. His gaze wasn't a question. It was a command. I felt like I was on the witness stand. If I answered, I would be scrutinized. If I stayed silent, I would be deemed incompetent. No matter what I chose, it could become the evidence used to write me out of Michael's life. Michael clenched his fist under the table and whispered, Don't say anything. I turned to him. He wouldn't look at me, his eyes squeezed shut, as if he were begging me to disappear. For the first time in my life, I felt completely alone, right next to the man I thought would protect me. I lifted my head, trying to find a breath. The room was so quiet I could hear the clock on the wall ticking. All eyes were on me, waiting to see what I would say, waiting for me to reveal a flaw so they could easily dismiss me. I pressed my lips together and slowly replied, I I am very honored to be here today. My voice trembled, but it didn't break. I looked directly at Richard Coleman. His expression was unreadable. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and the meal resumed. The sound of silverware on plates started again, but the smell of contempt still lingered around me. The middle-aged man gave a small, derisive laugh, and the woman with the bun shook her head. They didn't need words. With just a few frowns, a few sneers, they had turned me into the entertainment for an evening that was never meant for me. Michael sat in silence. He avoided my eyes. His fingers were clenched, the veins standing out, not to protect me, but to keep himself from falling apart under his father's gaze. I felt a heaviness in my chest. It wasn't shame anymore, it was helplessness. I wasn't just being scorned by the Coleman family, I was being turned into a redundant shadow by the very man I loved. In the midst of it all, Richard Coleman suddenly set down his knife. He looked directly at me, his voice hoarse but clear, loud enough for everyone to stop eating. If one day Michael had nothing, what would you do? The question landed on the table like a stone. Michael flinched, his face pale. I felt all eyes on me again. Some were smiling, as if waiting for me to trip. Others raised their wine glasses to their lips to hide a mocking laugh. I knew this wasn't a question. It was a trap. If I said I would stay, they would call me naive, a liar. If I said I wasn't sure, they would nod, seeing me as a gold digger. There was no right answer. I glanced at Michael, hoping for some help, but he was looking down, hiding. He didn't open his mouth, didn't save me from that moment. I was alone. I took a deep breath. If one day he had nothing, I would still go to work, and I would still take care of our family as I always would. I'm not afraid of hardship. What I'm most afraid of is a loveless marriage. The air at the table froze. A few people looked up, frowning. A cold huff came from the end of the table. Richard Coleman's expression didn't change. He just took a sip of wine, his eyes still locked on me. No nod, no shake of the head, just silent observation. Michael gently touched my hand under the table. This time, it wasn't a cold grip. His hand was trembling, weak, as if he wanted to apologize. But I pulled my hand away. I didn't need a clumsy apology. I needed him to stand up and tell his father that I was worthy. But he didn't. Richard spoke again, his voice sharper. You speak with confidence. But anyone can talk about loyalty. Only actions can prove it. He paused, then turned to Michael. And you, son? What do you think? Michael froze. He looked up, his mouth opening but no words coming out. The entire table was an audience, waiting for an answer. I looked at him, hoping he would say something, anything to defend me, to defend us. But in the end, all he did was give a small nod and whisper, I trust her. A few faint laughs broke out around the table. Trust her? A few people repeated, their voices laced with sarcasm. His answer was too weak, too meaningless in their eyes. I looked at Michael, my heart shattering. He had just missed the chance to prove he was strong enough to stand up to his family's judgment. And in that moment, I knew the real conflict wasn't between me and the Coleman family, it was between me and the man sitting right next to me. The heavy atmosphere hung over the room. Richard Coleman's eyes swept around the table and then settled on me. He wasn't smiling, but the corner of his mouth twitched, as if he had just found a new game. He slowly placed his napkin on the table, his voice even. Are you willing to try something, tonight, to prove what you just said? The table stirred, chairs scraped, and a few people leaned forward to get a better look at me. I felt my throat go dry, but I nodded. If I backed down now, they would have an excuse to say I was all talk. Richard leaned over and whispered something to his butler. A few minutes later, the butler returned with a small tray and placed it in front of me. On the tray was a single, thick, sealed envelope. Here, Richard said slowly, is the draft of an investment contract I left unfinished. An outsider would never be allowed to touch it. But tonight, I want to see what you will do. The room fell into a thick silence. I looked at the envelope, then up at him. "What do you want me to do with it?" I asked. Richard didn't answer right away. He took a sip of wine, set the glass down, his eyes glinting with a strange amusement. "Do what you think is right." My heart was pounding. A trap. I knew it. If I opened it, they would call me presumptuous, greedy. If I didn't touch it, they would call me timid, useless. Michael, beside me, his face pale, muttered, "Don't, don't do anything." I turned and looked into his frantic eyes. I saw no protection, no trust, only fear. The fear of confronting his father. I turned back to Richard Coleman. He wasn't blinking, his gaze piercing through me, as if he were dissecting my every thought. The entire room was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a mistake. I took a deep breath. My hand rested on the envelope, feeling the coldness through the thick paper. Michael's earlier warnings echoed in my head. Don't talk about your job, don't talk about your family, don't be late, and now, another rule, don't reveal yourself. But I couldn't continue to be a compliant shadow, waiting to be eliminated. I gently pushed the envelope back to the center of the table. "Sir, I don't need to open it. I don't need to read the numbers to prove I'm worthy. My value isn't in a contract, it's in how I live and how I keep my promises." A wave of murmurs spread through the table. A few people laughed mockingly. A few shook their heads. Michael quickly grabbed my hand and whispered urgently, "You don't understand. Why would you say that?" But I wasn't looking at him. I was looking at Richard Coleman. He didn't smile, nor was he angry. He was just silent for a few long seconds, then gave a slight nod. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, as if he had just noted another result in this strange test. The dinner continued, but from that moment on, I knew everything had changed. I was no longer just a guest. I had just stepped into the center of a chess game Richard Coleman had set up, and Michael was not on my side. The sound of silverware continued its steady rhythm, but in my ears, there was only a dull ringing. I sat straight, my hands in my lap, my back rigid. I knew I had just done what no one in this room wanted. I had refused to play their game. I could feel dozens of eyes on me. A few whispers were intentionally loud enough for me to hear. "Does she think she's so noble? All talk, nothing to back it up. Michael is so naive." Each whisper was a cold cut against my skin. I wanted to stand up and leave that room, but my feet felt nailed to the floor. I knew that if I left, they would gloat, and Richard Coleman would cross my name off his list immediately. I looked down, pretending to focus on the food in front of me. But my throat was tight. I couldn't swallow a single bite. Michael gently touched my hand under the table, his voice pleading, "You did that. You have no idea what my father is thinking. You just made everything worse." I looked up at him. My eyes met the fear in his. But at the same time, I saw it clearly. He wasn't thinking about me. He was only thinking about his future, his inheritance, his place in this family. My heart clenched. The man who had once held my hand through the hard times was now letting go of me in the very moment I needed him most. That feeling wasn't shame anymore. It was a deep, suffocating sadness. I felt lost, as if I were in a crowded room but completely alone. I took a deep breath, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. I couldn't let them see me break. I couldn't let myself cry here, in front of these people who were waiting for me to show any sign of weakness. Richard Coleman remained silent. He said nothing, made no comment, just observed. But his gaze made me shudder. Not because it was cold, but because I couldn't guess what he was thinking. He was like a judge, sitting calmly, watching the defendant stumble and taking notes for his final verdict. I clenched my hands in my lap, my nails digging into my palms until it hurt, but instead of fear, I felt a strange calm spreading through me. If I was going to be eliminated, then I would be eliminated for being who I am, not for trying to pretend to be someone else. That thought was like a gentle breeze, allowing me to breathe after so many suffocating minutes. I looked up, directly at Richard. He was still sitting there, motionless, his gaze piercing. This time, I didn't look away. I let him look at me, let the entire room see that I would not bow my head. Michael tugged at my sleeve and whispered urgently, "What are you doing? Don't challenge him." I didn't answer. In that moment, I saw it clearly. I could no longer rely on Michael to stand firm in this room. I could only rely on myself. A spoon clinked from across the table. The woman with the high bun gave a small, sarcastic smile. Confidence. But confidence doesn't feed a family. I turned to her. Her eyes were filled with mockery, waiting for a reaction. But I just gave a faint smile. A smile not to please, but for myself. My heart was still aching, still in pain. But underneath it all, I began to feel something new. A small, slow, but steady strength. I didn't know what Richard Coleman would do next. I didn't know if Michael would have the courage to take my hand and walk out of this room. But I knew one thing. I would not let myself disappear amidst these cold gazes. I sat there, trying to keep my hands from shaking, though my palms were damp with sweat. On the table, the lavish dishes were arranged so beautifully they looked more like museum exhibits than food. But to me, they were just cold, tasteless decorations. I closed my eyes for a moment, and the image that appeared in my mind wasn't this opulent room, but the small kitchen of my own family. My mother, standing by the stove, a few silver strands in her hair, her calloused hands slicing vegetables. My father, sitting at the old wooden table, grating papers, looking up with a smile as I walked by. In that house, no one measured me by money. No one asked if I was elegant enough to sit at the table. They only cared if I had eaten enough, if I had gotten enough sleep, if I had kept my promises. I suddenly felt a sting in my eyes. Here, in this gilded room, everyone looked at me as if I were unworthy. But in that memory, I remembered that I had once been my parents' everything, and that was the only truth that kept me from breaking down right now. Michael took a sharp breath and turned to whisper, "Don't say anything else. My father is watching. The quieter you are, the better." His words were another knife. He didn't see that I was hurting. He only saw the risk of losing his father's approval. He needed a wife who knew how to not ruin the plan, not a partner. I turned to him. His eyes were downcast, avoiding mine. A chilling cold spread through my chest. The man I had trusted, the one I had leaned on, now just wanted me to disappear so he could easily keep his place. But I wouldn't disappear. I couldn't. I took a deep breath, touched my spoon to my plate, making a small, clear sound. A few eyes turned to me. But this time, I didn't look away. I looked directly at them, not smiling, not bowing. I let them see. I was still here, despite the coldness, despite the contempt. I realized a truth. What they called luxury was actually a net trapping them. They weren't free. They were just afraid. Afraid of being cast out by Richard Coleman, afraid of losing his approval, afraid of no longer having a seat at this table. I remembered my father's words from when I was a child. You don't need to please everyone. You just need to do what you believe is right. That simple sentence now echoed clearly in my mind, a lifeline pulling me out of the swamp of humiliation. I set down my spoon and lifted my chin. I didn't need to scream, didn't need to justify myself. I just needed to keep my back straight. Richard Coleman glanced at me again. His gaze was deep, unreadable. But I saw something strange. He was no longer just looking at me as an outsider. He was looking at me as an enigma he hadn't yet solved. Beside me, Michael flinched slightly, as if he had noticed it too. But instead of taking the chance to stand with me, he lowered his head and continued to hide. The room slowly returned to its quiet chatter, the sound of silverware on china. But inside me, a strange calm was growing. I no longer felt like I was being swallowed. I felt like I was standing firm, at least with myself. I knew this battle wasn't over, but at least I had found my weapon, my composure. The air in the dining room was still thick, but I had stopped letting it suffocate me. I sat up straight, my hands resting calmly on the table. I no longer needed to prove myself with words. I let my silence be my answer. Richard Coleman set down his wine glass, his fingers tapping a light rhythm on the stem. Immediately, the room fell silent again. People stopped their conversations, their forks hovering over their plates. He was still sitting there, but his presence was enough to lock the entire table in place. "Good," he said, his voice low. "You know how to keep your composure. But composure isn't enough." I didn't blink, holding his gaze. He gave a slight nod, as if pleased with my directness. "In this life," he continued, Everyone has to face a choice, to protect themselves or to protect someone else, and I want to know which you would choose." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the table, and then suddenly turned to Michael. "Son," his voice hardened, "stand up." Michael flinched and awkwardly stood, his face pale, his hands shaking so much his chair scraped loudly against the floor. Richard tilted his head and signaled to his butler. The butler left and returned with a dark wooden box, placing it in the middle of the table. Everyone stared at it, and my heart pounded, not knowing what was coming. Richard opened the box. Inside was a thick stack of documents, neatly tied. He placed them in front of Michael. "This is the project I left for you to prepare, but you never dared to take responsibility for it yourself. You relied on others, you avoided my gaze, and you found excuses." Michael froze, sweat beading on his forehead. Richard turned to me. "If you truly think you can be with my son, I want you to tell me if he can be trusted." The room was dead silent. I looked at Michael. His eyes were pleading with me, a look of frantic, trembling fear. He didn't say it, but I understood. He wanted me to say, "Yes, he is worthy." He wanted me to protect him in front of his father. But in that moment, I also saw the entire evening replayed, his averted eyes when they mocked me, his whispered pleas for me to be quiet, his trembling hand pulling me into the shadows. Not once had he stood up to shield me. If I said yes now, I would once again become the shadow behind him, a nameless, valueless shadow. I took a deep breath. "You're asking me if I trust Michael?" I looked directly at Richard, then around the table. I trust the man I fell in love with, but I don't trust the way he stays silent when I'm being humiliated. I don't trust the weakness he shows when he just bows his head to every judgment. Everyone was stunned. Michael's mouth fell open, his eyes red. He whispered, How could you?" I didn't let him finish. I continued, "I didn't come here to win your approval. I came here because I want to marry Michael, not the Coleman family, not the inheritance. But if even he won't stand up to defend us, then I'm sorry. No one else can convince me to stay at this table." The room erupted in whispers. Many faces were in shock. Some shook their heads in disapproval, and a few even smirked, enjoying this rare spectacle. Richard Coleman didn't react immediately. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowed, observing me as if he had just seen something he had been waiting for a long time. "Interesting," he said quietly, his tone unclear whether it was sarcasm or praise. "Very interesting." Michael collapsed back into his chair, his face ashen. He whispered to me, his voice choked, "You just ruined everything." I looked at him. My heart was aching, but my voice was strangely calm. "No, Michael, I just said the truth that everyone saw but no one dared to speak." Richard Coleman let out a soft, short laugh that made the entire table vibrate. Everyone fell silent. He tapped his fingers on the table, his eyes as sharp as a knife. "Finally, someone who dares to tell the truth in this room." No one moved. I could feel it clearly. This moment was the turning point. From here, I would either be cast out immediately, or a different door would open. Richard Coleman's short laugh had just ended, but the entire table remained silent, as if no one could believe what had just happened. No one in this house had ever seen an outsider speak so directly to him, let alone a young woman with no standing in the family. Richard placed his hands on the table and leaned forward slightly. His gray-blue eyes were fixed on me, the light in them no longer cold and indifferent, but a sharp, keen interest. "You know," he said slowly, "for years, this table has been filled with nothing but skilled actors. Everyone smiles, everyone agrees, everyone cleverly says what I want to hear. But the moment they walk out of this room, they turn their backs, they betray, they choose the easy path." He paused and glanced at Michael. The look made Michael shrink back like a child caught cheating. "My son," Richard said, his voice dropping, "has spent years just bowing his head, just being afraid. You think silence is wisdom, but in reality, it's just cowardice." Michael went pale, his hands trembling. He opened his mouth to object, but then clamped it shut, unable to say a word. Richard turned back to me. "But you chose to speak the truth. The price could be losing everything, but at least it's a choice you're willing to take responsibility for." He tapped his fingers lightly on the table. Immediately, the butler approached and placed another wooden box in front of me, smaller, more compact, and carefully locked. "This," Richard said, his voice firm, "is the real test." I looked at the box, my heart pounding. I knew that all eyes were on me again, this time not with mocking whispers, but with a tense curiosity. Richard continued slowly. "Inside is a copy of a portion of the assets I plan to distribute. I've given it to a few people before. Some fought over it, some eagerly agreed, some trembled and refused. None of them truly understood what I wanted to see." He tilted his head, his voice low and clear. "I want to know what you will choose." The entire room seemed to freeze. Michael choked out, his voice strained. "Father, you can't." But Richard held up a hand, silencing him. His eyes remained locked on me, waiting. I gently touched the box. The wood was cool, the metal lock gleaming under the light. The room held its breath. I understood that this was the moment that would decide everything. If I opened it, they would label me as greedy. If I pushed it away, they would call me weak. Any action could become an excuse to remove me from this family. But then, my own father's words from my childhood echoed in my mind. "You don't need to please everyone. You just need to do what you believe is right." I took a breath, placed my hands on the lid of the box, and then didn't open it. I pushed it gently back toward Richard. "I didn't come here to fight for assets. I just need to know one thing. Do you value truth and courage more than these lavish parties? If you do, I think you've had your answer in your own eyes for a while now." The entire table was silent. Richard looked at me, and then a thin smile appeared on his face. Not a polite smile, not a sarcastic one, but something almost rare acknowledgement. He gave a slight nod and then turned to Michael. "Son, you just missed your chance to prove your mettle, but fortunately, the woman beside you just proved it for you both." Michael looked as if he had been struck. His face was pale, his eyes welling with tears, but he couldn't say a word. I sat still, my heart a storm of emotions. I didn't know if I had just saved myself or thrown myself into an even bigger battle. But I knew one thing. The dynamic had shifted. Richard Coleman no longer saw me as an outsider. He saw me as an official player in his game. Richard Coleman was silent for a long time. His fingers tapped a light rhythm on the table, a steady beat that made everyone's heart clench with each echo. The entire room waited. Every breath was suspended. Then he slowly stood up. By reflex, the entire table fell silent. No one dared to move. The yellow light cast a tall, imposing shadow of him, as if silence itself were his possession. He placed his hands on the back of his chair, his eyes sweeping over every face before finally settling on me. "I have seen enough," he said slowly, "of the empty words, the weak nods, the fake smiles. For too many years." He turned to Michael. His voice suddenly turned ice cold. "And you, Michael, my son, you have disappointed your father." Michael went pale, his lips trembling. He opened his mouth, but Richard held up a hand to stop him. "You had a woman sitting right beside you, being belittled, disdained, and humiliated. But you did not stand up. You did not protect her. You chose to be silent." His voice was like a series of hammer blows. "I do not need a son who only knows how to be silent." Michael lowered his head. His shoulders trembled. He whispered, as soft as the wind, "I'm sorry." No one responded to his apology. Richard turned back to me. For the first time all evening, his eyes were no longer frozen. They were sharp, but there was a flicker of something hard to name, perhaps respect, perhaps curiosity. "But you," he said, "you didn't come here to flatter. You dared to refuse. You dared to speak the truth." He lifted the small wooden box from the table and handed it back to the butler, then walked slowly back to the head of the table. As he sat down, the air in the room was still as tense as a drawn bowstring. Everyone waited for his next words. Richard raised his wine glass and held it up slightly, his voice echoing across the table. "Tonight, I have seen something rare, integrity, and it was not in my son, it was in the woman beside him." A wave of murmurs started again. A few faces showed clear shock. Others gave a slight nod, as if in silent agreement. I sat there, my heart pounding. I didn't know if I should feel relieved or more afraid. I just knew that in this moment the scales had shifted. Richard set down his glass and continued. Michael, your position in the company, in this family? He paused, his eyes sharp and cold. Will no longer be based on your last name. It will be based on the woman you choose. If you lose her, you will have nothing left. Michael was stunned. His eyes were red, his breathing ragged. He turned to me, but I couldn't look at him the same way anymore. I saw a small man cowering in his father's shadow. The dinner ended in silence. No one bothered to whisper anymore. No one dared to sneer. Everyone left the table in an unusual, suffocating quiet. Richard Coleman was the last to stand up. He walked past me and paused for a moment. His hand gently touched the back of my chair. He didn't look at me, but he left me with one sentence. Hold on to that spirit. It's worth more than any asset. Then he walked away. I was left alone in the vast room. Michael came over and took my hand. His voice was trembling. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I left you alone. I looked at him. My heart was a mess of love, disappointment, and sorrow. I didn't answer. I just gently pulled my hand away, stood up, and walked out of that room. In the hallway, a cold wind blew. I took a deep breath and lifted my head. For the first time all evening, I could breathe. I understood that I didn't need the Coleman family's approval to know my own worth. That worth came from myself, from the choice to stand up when everyone wanted me to bow, from the courage to not let myself disappear in their cold gazes. Richard Coleman had seen that. Michael hadn't. And that was the distance he would have to cross on his own if he still wanted to hold my hand. That night, I walked out of that mansion with a calm I had never known. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew one thing. I had held on to the most important thing, myself. In a world where money and power can make people kneel, the most precious thing is still the courage to stand up straight. I had chosen to stand. That night, as I walked out of the heavy iron gates of the Coleman estate, I realized something. A person's true value isn't in their inheritance, nor is it in their seat at the dinner table. It's in the choices we make when we face contempt and injustice. Do we bow our heads, or do we dare to stand tall? I chose to stand tall. What about you? If you were in my position that evening, would you stay silent to be accepted, or would you speak your truth, even if it meant losing everything? Please share your honest thoughts in the comments sometimes. Your story can be a comfort to someone else in a similar situation. If you can relate to these dramatic yet real slices of life, please follow the channel so you don't miss out on other family stories where we realize that sometimes cruelty is most apparent at the dinner table, but it is also from there that a person's true strength is revealed.